All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Baker Institute. Thank you for coming tonight. We're here tonight to discuss how should the U.S. think about the rising superpowers of India and China. I'm Russell Green. I'm a fellow here at the Baker Institute. I also spent 4 years at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, which raised my own interest in the rising powers in India. I should mention that originally we had planned, I'll be moderating the discussion tonight. I should mention that originally we had planned to have Steve Lewis also joining me. He's another fellow here at the Baker Institute, but he had some urgent family matters to attend to, so he wasn't able to join us tonight. The reason we are interested in this topic, or maybe the reason why I'm interested in the topic, is these are two giant countries that have clear economic potential, tremendous economic potential. And when you look at China, certainly they have dramatic potential to rival the U.S. As a superpower country. India is not very far behind, although we can talk about whether they're actually interested in becoming a global superpower or not. But this rise of these two major powers has really important implications for the way power dynamics are going to work out around the globe. It's especially important for the United States, since we have been the sole superpower for quite a while. But it's certainly, even the way the U.S. responds to India and China has important implications for the rest of the world. So when I think about this topic, and I don't want to step on the turf of our speakers tonight, but in discussing this, but what first comes to mind is a very basic question, which is, what does superpower rivalry actually look like in these days? The last time we had superpower rivalry was in the days of the Cold War, and so you might think that it means we're really adversaries and we've got guns pointed at each other, and it's a very contentious type dynamic. But it's easy to imagine a superpower rivalry that's a much more benign form. So when I was trying to come up with an analogy, I thought, well, imagine the U.S. relationship with France. Now, France isn't a superpower just because they're a little bit smaller. So imagine France multiplied by 3. And you think about the relationship that we have with France. Well, France is another like-minded country. It's got an open democratic government, basic commitment to free market economy, deep ties with the United States, and a clear intent to be a responsible stakeholder of the global system. And so this allows us, and clearly the U.S. and France don't see eye to eye on every issue. I mean, just think about Freedom Prize and how it's easy for issues between the U.S. and France to get blown up. But at the same time, we always operate with a degree of mutual respect, and it's clear that we're not going to antagonize each other directly. We're never really going to come to blows with France, no matter how much we may disagree on other foreign policy activities. And so if you think of that as another form of superpower rivalry, then when you think about how will the U.S. relationship with U.S. and India evolve, the question becomes, are we going to evolve with something that looks much more like an old Cold War style relationship, or are we going to evolve to this more benign form of superpower rivalry? The current conventional wisdom tends to put China in the mold of a Cold War style rival, or maybe not quite that far, but sort of in the adversary camp. And the current conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. regarding India puts them much more in the ally type camp. And so the idea is that as China is rising as an adversary, the U.S. can use India as somewhat of a counterpoint to balance off the rising power of China within Asia. So this is sort of the discussion that I was hoping that we might have tonight. Both of our guests here have written books on this topic, and so we're really fortunate to have both of them here. I'll start off introducing Rollie. She's an expert on international security affairs, particularly with South Asia, East Asia, Iran, and Central Asia. She's had articles that have appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times, the Financial Times, and the International Herald Tribune. She's been a political scientist at RAND, an associate professor for the Defense Department, and at the Vlerick Business School in Belgium, and she's been a journalist for the Yomiuri Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. Most recently, she's been a fiction writer, and she's written some political thriller, or I should say a political thriller, that's just in the editing phase, so hang on tight, and you can see it come out hopefully soon. And she got a PhD from Johns Hopkins, from the School of Advanced International Studies, which everybody in DC knows as SAIS. Eric is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. In fact, I believe they were both at RAND at the same time for a while. He's a specialist in East Asian security issues, and he's published articles on Japanese and Chinese foreign policy and strategic issues in foreign affairs, international security, current history, and the national interest. He's also been a senior fellow of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and visiting faculty member at Boston College, as well as having served in the Army Reserves and National Guard. And his PhD is from MIT. So now let me tell you a little story about the origin of this event and how it is that that we came to have this specific topic discussed today. So Eric's book, which is up here on the left, just came out this year, and it's really generated quite a bit of buzz, and I'll explain why in just a second. But I had read about it. It was written up in The Economist and the Wall Street Journal, and it got a lot of attention in the Indian press. And so I was very interested in it. And just a little while after that, I was introduced to Rollie. And I'd heard about her book, and I actually thought that she was the author of Eric's book, because I had just read all about this book, and to a non-expert like me, her book and his book basically sounded like the same book. But it's especially confusing if you look at the two covers. You really can't blame anybody for getting confused as to who wrote which book. And the key, though, there's one key distinction, and that is, if you'll notice, you look very carefully, Eric has the Indian picture on top and the Chinese picture on the bottom, where Rollie has the Chinese picture on top and the Indian picture on the bottom. And this is actually a very important distinction to make because of the thesis that they each present in their books. And so to summarize, and I'm going to let them put these in their own words, but in my words, Eric really takes sort of a contrarian position, saying that, in fact, India may not, if you look at the evidence of how India behaves in the real world, in an objective way, comparing it with China, that India and China don't look all that different. And so if China is firmly in the adversary camp, maybe we should take a second, sort of think twice about where we place India. Should it be in the ally camp or the adversary camp? Now, this is all very simplistic. Whereas Rollie takes maybe what might be considered more the conventional wisdom, that is that India, and I'll let them again explain their reasoning for this, but that India has much more potential to be sort of a trusted ally than China does to this effect. So I looked at these two books and I thought, well, they've got their pictures opposite of each other. This will make a perfect debate. So I invited them both here, and fortunately they both agreed, and so we're fortunate to have them both here tonight. They both flown in just for this event, and so I guess we'll get started. But I first wanted to say thank you for coming, and I'll come join them, and we can start. So I thought, to begin, since I had the temerity to sort of summarize your arguments for you, I would give you the chance to rebut me to begin with. And so maybe, Eric, if you'd like to take the floor first and sort of explain your approach to this issue.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Russell, for having us. I really appreciate it. The book's been out for several months, and actually this is the first time I've had a chance to come out in public and talk about it. I don't know what that says about me or my proclivities for staying in the house, but Rand keeps us busy. So thanks for inviting us. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm delighted to be with Rollie. As Russell said, we spent several years together at Rand. This was sort of billed as a debate counterweight or double trouble. I'm not sure how much of a debate it actually is. Rollie and I saw eye to eye on many issues at RAND, probably most issues of relevance here tonight. I obviously share some artistic tastes with Rollie. Not only do the covers look a lot alike, but they both have camels on them. Hers came out first, so there's probably an intellectual property rights issue there, but hopefully she won't take that up with me. Okay. So anyways, moving on, let me just say a few words about what the motivation for our book was. I think Russell really hit on the key motivation, which is that in the U.S. public discourse, particularly in the international relations community and the defense community, there's a dramatically divergent view of China and India. Obviously, we engage and cooperate with China on many issues, but we always hedge against it as well, and it's described oftentimes as, if not a potential threat, then certainly a potential challenger. And we pay attention to deterring China and our military capabilities vis-a-vis China, whereas in the case of India, it's regarded more as a natural partner, a counterweight to China. Sometimes this is justified by its democratic nature, other times by its power position and geographic location. But what interested us, and I should say this is a co-authored book. My co-author is George Gilboy, and he lives in China, so it was a bit of a stretch to get him here. But part of our motivation was really a question. Is part of the reason that we have such divergent views of these two countries explained by the fact that we ask very different questions? For historical and other reasons, there is a chance that we could wind up in a shooting war with China. We have historical commitments to Taiwan. We have treaty relations with Japan, Philippines, other states in East Asia. So at least in the security community, the question is, how do we deal with China? How do we confront that potential threat? How do we deter China? Whereas in the case of India, where we had very thin relations throughout the Cold War, we're sort of coming to India in a way, we're returning to India and asking how can India be useful to us as a counterweight, largely as a counterweight vis-a-vis China. So we're asking very different questions. So it's natural that when you ask how is China a problem or how is it a challenge, that you're going to see that China is a challenge. When you ask how can India help us, that you will get a very different set of answers. So that was the motivation. What we wanted to do was ask the same set of questions in a more structured and rigorous way about their general international behavior. So we looked at strategic culture, we looked at their general foreign policy, patterns in the use of force, border disputes. We also looked at several aspects of military policy where the United States often criticizes China, lack of transparency in military budgets, defense budget buildup, doctrines that are now tending more towards emphasis on offensive action and preemption. And then in the trade realm, the various complaints that we have about the Chinese market, exchange rates, and also their international economic behavior, their investments in countries that we call rogue states or have issues with. So if we ask these questions, how do both of these states behave in each of these areas with some, at least an effort at an objective evaluation of their behavior, how do they stack up? And just to go to our conclusions, and I'll just be very brief, and maybe we can get into some of these. I'm sure we'll get into some of these in more detail. But the conclusions, I think the first and chief one, which won't surprise anybody probably, is that both of these countries have their own national interests, and they pursue them vigorously. Oftentimes, the interests of both of them are not convergent or diverge from those of the United States. And by the same token, they're also oftentimes convergent with one another. Both are willing to use force in the pursuit of their interests. Oftentimes, both vote against the United States and the United Nations. If you look at military doctrine, transparency, and the economic issues, they differ less than one might think. Now, there are various patterns. For example, India is more transparent in its military budgeting, but there are also more similarities than one might expect to find. And it's difficult overall to say that one is far more problematic than the other from the perspective of U.S. national interests. We make a number of recommendations in the book. I think we've got 10 that I will not roll through here. But one of them is that we should institutionalize a more rigorous sort of comparative framework to our assessment of foreign states. And actually, one thing I should have said about Rollie's book is I think we did acknowledge it in ours as the one other book that we could find that takes a rigorous comparative approach to the two countries. There are lots of books out there that talk about the rise of Chindia or China and India, or talk about the relations between the two, but there really aren't any others that take a very, that take a rigorous comparative approach. So that's one point. Another point is that the United States should recognize that we have a number of common interests with both of these states, but that they both actually present challenges to the United States in a number of ways. Russell asked whether this was France or was the alternative the
Cold
Soviet
War.
Union,
Yeah,
right?
Soviet
the Cold War, right? And I'm not sure whether I would come down definitively on one side or the other, but in the French case, although we had, we had different detailed national interests, and France certainly had an interest in asserting international leadership and had a somewhat different position in Europe, for example. Nevertheless, France was a developed state. We were both facing the same enemy. The enemy was fairly clear during the Cold War. Today, we're facing two very large states, much larger than France, so certainly the impact will be larger than any rivalry could have been with France. On the other hand, it's not the Cold War. Both of these countries are tightly tied to the international system, and we can go into their views on global governance and whether they want to change the international system, but they are tightly within the international system at this point. So I don't think it's a Cold War style threat, but I think it is larger than the challenges that we face are larger than those that we dealt with in the French case. We don't actually, this is the one thing I'll probably take issue with in Russell's description is that we don't describe India as I think you said an adversary, but rather as a state that will pose serious challenges to the United States. And we need to recognize those challenges. We need to build a partnership with India, but I think there's an argument for being a little bit more careful on the military side and building up a broader base of common interests on the economic, political, and cultural side first. And then we do need to maintain robust deterrence in East Asia. So that's one thing. I mean, we can cooperate with China in all kinds of areas. At the end of the day, though, having said we hedge against China, we actually still do need to hedge against China, but we should be more realistic in our views of India. So those are at least several of the conclusions that we reached.
Thanks. All right, Rollie, you want to sort of describe your sort of initial approach to the topic?
Sure. Well, first off, I want to say I agree with Eric on many, if not most, of the points that he just mentioned. There are significant similarities between India and China, and in their policies, and even in certain ones of their interests, because of the similarities in their size and their level of economic development and historical reasons. And at the same time, I would have to say that in my study, I outlined the fact that despite the fact that these two countries have a lot of similar policies, a lot of similar policy programs even over the past few decades, there are actual very significant differences that cannot be overlooked, and these lead back to their national interests. And I do have to make one correction, though. This book, I will not say that it supports the conventional wisdom. It came out before the conventional wisdom. I started the study back when nobody ever put the word India and China together, and I started it closer to 2000, and this book was published in 2006. So I would say that it's actually at the forefront of what is now known as the conventional wisdom. But in any case, I'd like to just outline a few of the differences that I would consider relevant here, and then I'll go into some of the study and how it and how it analyzes that. So, for example, despite the fact that now they may have similar policies that we see on Syria, Iran, environment, things like that, you'll see that, as Eric mentioned, they disagree on the most critical one is Taiwan, an area that China would call its critical national interest, which is directly opposed to U.S. interests. And there is no parallel in Indian foreign policy to the Taiwan issue. So in the sense that there is no parallel where India has a critical national interest that is opposed to the U.S. And I think that's the most fundamental issue that underpins a lot of this. Secondly, there's the fact that China has territorial disputes with pretty much almost all of its neighbors, I believe. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, India, So, and on the flip side, India has friendly ties and defense cooperations with these countries who happen to be our friends and allies in the region. So there's some obvious similar interest there. In terms of areas like North Korea, again, China has different interests than India has, and China's been far more supportive of North Korea. When it comes to insurgencies and organized crime, China has actually, even though as a state it's said that it does not support these activities, through companies such as Norinco, it has shown itself to be a supporter of insurgency and organized crime in Asia in particular, but also elsewhere. On the economic front, China has engaged in what I would call manipulative currency behavior, making sure that the renminbi is low enough to keep their exports cheap and their imports expensive. And again, this is something that, while India has attempted to work on its currency, it's certainly not as it doesn't have a managed peg or something like that for the Indian rupee. And then, as a result of that, on the economic front, I would mention that China also uses these massive foreign reserves to back their state-owned purchases of natural resources around the world. For example, oil and gas, which is something that you all would know a lot about here. It tends to also, using these foreign reserve banks that it has, to be able to buy at above market rates. And this is because we're talking about state ownership of companies, which actually makes for a different dynamic when it comes to market buying and selling on the market for the Chinese government than it does for India, for example. Plus, India doesn't have the type of reserves that China does to be able to pull that off. But even if it did, I don't believe that India would buy at above market rates. And then lastly, the rare earth minerals that China is currently buying around the world, and currently holds 23% of the world supply of rare earth minerals of reserves, and supplies 90% of the world's demand for these minerals that are used in everything from your Prius to your cell phones. And this is highly relevant because they have been known to use these resources and their power over these resources in a way that is coercive towards Japan, for example. Now those are just some of the examples of differences. As I said, as Eric mentioned, there are tons of similarities, but I think that these differences are very relevant. Now, the question is what explains these differences, and that's what I got into in this book. The study, what I did was I conducted over 120 interviews in China and India of elites and decision makers and scholars and journalists in both countries, and I asked them the exact same questions in order to find out what are their national interests, saying that, look, you both have all these similar things that you've been doing, why? What came out of this conversation with all of these decision makers in both countries was that it was something very interesting, is that they don't have the same national interests, though you might assume that they would, and that these differences in their national interests come down to their political differences, their institutions, the fact that one is democratic and one is not. Now, this has nothing to do with democratic peace, saying that, okay, democracies don't fight one another, only communists and authoritarian regimes do. It has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with is the fact that the national identity of these countries is actually different in a multi-party state than it is in a single-party state. So what we found in the what I found in the interviews was that when Indians thought, if you ask them, for example, what does it mean to be Indian, they would say, I'm part of a democratic country that's India. They wouldn't answer with something like, I'm Gujarati, or I'm Muslim, or I'm Hindu, or something like that. They would say, oh, well, I'm Indian, and it means that I'm from India. They kind of thought it was a silly question in a way. When I asked the same question to the Chinese, overwhelmingly the response was, it's Han, which is an ethnic descriptor. And it's a very fascinating answer. And it led to a lot of revelations along the way. Because what it meant was, if you have, first of all, they didn't identify with their government. They didn't identify as, nobody said, it means I'm communist. I mean, that was just laughable. Nobody responded with that. And nobody came up with, it means that I'm just Chinese, part of this nice Chinese system. But when I would drill deeper, then what you would find is that, oh, well, then how do the Tibetans get included? How do you get the Uyghurs in? How do you get the Taiwanese in? How do you fit everybody in your definition? And that's what led to an understanding that one of their largest weaknesses was a national identity. They felt that it was weak. They didn't have a political identity to tie themselves together, and that was the strength that the Indians had because of the democratic system. It's kind of like being American means that you're not from Alabama or Texas. It means that you're American. And this has to do with the fact that you voted for your government. Now, in the end, what it meant was that for the Chinese state, because they didn't have a very strong national identity, when you asked them what were their risks, what does it mean for you, what are your threats, their threats ended up being very internal, because, of course, they're worried that the place will fall apart. And this came up over and over again. As a one-party state, the survival of the Communist Party came up as their major critical national interest. And behind that was the fact that they need to keep the territory together. The main national interest was, we have to keep the territory together, and we have to keep the Communist Party in power. And everybody who means anything in China has a vested interest in the Communist Party remaining in power, because they all have, if the Communist Party loses, everyone loses. There is nobody to replace it. There is nobody standing in the back wings. But in India, what you find is that when one party fails, for example, if Kashmir gets lost by the current government, then, okay, they'll get voted out for being a complete failure, and another party will come in. Nobody says India will collapse. Whereas in China, if you ask them, well, what happens if Taiwan were to get up and leave? Or if Taiwan were to be lost in a war, people were really, really scared. They said, well, if Taiwan goes, that's it. The Communist Party is going to blow. That's their entire reason almost for existence. It's, legitimacy. Their legitimacy is pinned on economic growth and keeping Taiwan. So it's very fascinating that it's a very different sense of risk. And it means a lot for crisis stability. In a crisis, China will do anything to keep the party in power. And you have to remember that the People's Liberation Army, the army of China, works to protect the party, not the people. In India, this isn't the case. In India, the army is working to protect the people, not any party. So when push comes to shove on Taiwan, it's highly likely that China would likely go to war against the U.S. and its allies. Why? Because China sees territory like Taiwan critical to the party's legitimacy, critical for keeping the country together. And there is no similar scenario in India. Like I said, Kashmir, nobody's scared that the country is going to fall apart if Kashmir blows. So what that means is that in the end, China's national interests always reflect foremost the party's interests, including in foreign policy. And India's national interests reflect a conglomeration of political interests from across the whole spectrum, in the same way that U.S. foreign policy does or French foreign policy does. And sometimes that will agree with us, and sometimes it won't. But I do believe that in terms of long term, it's a far stronger base for building strategic relations. And in answer to the French question, just briefly, I'll say that I actually do think it's a lot closer to France. And I do think that they're not going to always agree with us, and maybe not even to the extent that France does. But I don't think it's similar to the Soviet Union example.
Okay, great. Well, it sounds like the relationship with the U.S. and India and China is very complex, and so there's a lot of ways that we could look at this. And I know certainly in your books, you both look across a wide spectrum of issues to make this comparison. I thought we might start with voting at the UN. That's a very clean example because all the votes go on record and you can easily tally it up almost in a mathematical way. But it's interesting because at the moment, India is just ending a 2-year term as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. And just before India began its term, President Obama visited India and endorsed India getting a permanent seat, on the Security Council. But then, as India has occupied this seat in the Security Council, I think the United States has had a bit of consternation at the voting record of the UN. In particular, I think it was well noted that India abstained on the Libya no-fly zone, and they haven't always been consistently helpful in addressing the crisis in Syria, at least from an American standpoint. And you're actually hearing rumblings in the United States, in Washington, that maybe it's good that when President Obama endorsed India getting a permanent seat in the Security Council, that he didn't put a time frame on that promise, so that it gives us some time to basically wait until we're a bit happier with India's position. So maybe I'll start, Eric. I know you, in your book, went through in quite a lot of detail the different voting patterns. Is India following sort of what you might think of as a China pattern of at the UN of acting very independently from the U.S., or what's sort of the evidence you've seen?
Short answer is yes. Just to come back to part of your lead-in. I think in some ways, when the United States again returned to India, and with the idea in mind of forming a stronger strategic partnership with India, we really did come at it with sort of a blank slate on which we painted our hopes and aspirations for this kind of partnership. So I think you're right that certainly to an extent that honeymoon period is over. The voting records in the UN are quite interesting, not just for what they say about the particular issues in question, but for how we think about how both of these countries perceive their international interests. It's hard without PowerPoint to put up all the numbers, but we did parse voting records in the UN General Assembly. Since those are the easiest ones to do, we were in a sense looking under the streetlight, but then we went back and at least took a qualitative look at UN Security Council votes as well. But in the UN General Assembly, we looked at votes on a number of issues that were critical to the United States, votes on Iran, for example, Sudan, WMD, and several other issues. On this range of issues, the convergence between the agreement between Chinese and Indian votes was very high. So on Iran, for example, of the 22 resolutions that we looked at, and this was all of the resolutions on Iran, China and India voted together 73% of the time. On Sudan, 92% of the time. And on WMD, 62 votes, they voted together 31% of the time. That's far higher than the convergence or agreement between the votes of either India in the United States or China in the United States. In the Indian case, there were 0 votes in agreement on Iran, 8% in agreement on Sudan, and 6% on WMD. So they are quite dramatically different. Now, there have been some counter-arguments to this, that when it really matters and the chips are down in the UN Security Council, India does tend to vote more with the United States. And that's true, although the record there is mixed as well. In Libya, both India and China abstained on the vote on the no-fly zone in March of 2011. On the Syria case, India voted yes in 2012 in July, but it didn't blame either side for the violence. And then on Iran, it said it would honor sanctions against Iran, but it would oppose any unilateral efforts at sanctions. Now, both of these states, China and India, as well as other states that import a lot of oil, Korea and Japan, from Iran, got U.S. waivers on sanctions, and those have been renewed recently, I believe this week. Of those countries, India was the only one whose oil imports from Iran were higher in the first 10 months of the year than than they were in the preceding period. So the record is quite mixed, and I guess if I were again to return to this issue of the difference between their voting in UN Security Council and in the UN General Assembly, I guess I would ask you, yes, the UN Security Council, those votes are more meaningful. On the other hand, which reflects the inclinations of the country in question, the votes in the UN Security Council under great duress from the United States, or the votes in the General Assembly where there's much less pressure from the United States. So the record is quite mixed, and there's really a greater convergence on a wide range of issues between the two. And I think this gets back to a fundamental commonality in their national interests, which is the assertion of sovereignty rights over collective security in the international community. And this is just one area where China and India really agree more in global governance than either one really agrees with the United States. And that's a very strongly held view in India, as it is in China. So that's the...
Okay. Rollie, do you have I don't know if your interpretation of the UN voting is any different, but
I'll just add very briefly. I think that it's very nice data you have, by the way. That's very nice. But yeah, so India does agree with China on certain things. I would say in several areas, as you probably, if you go drill down, you know already that China often vetoes, for example, sanctions against Syria or something like that, and India will more likely abstain. And this type of distinction is for, I think, an important reason. I think the most important reason to keep in mind as to why they vote similarly, not identically, has to do with the fact that China does feel very, very strongly in making sure that there is no vote that goes through that sets a precedent for foreign countries intervening in the internal territorial disputes of a country, because that would set a precedent for countries obviously coming in, intervening in Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and so forth. So there's a precedent, a very strong precedent issue at work with China. I'd say that on the India side, you would end up with an abstain vote most of the time, but not because India is concerned someone's going to come in and intervene on, for example, Kashmir or something. It's more because India tends to take a very ideological stance. And as Eric mentioned, they feel strongly that countries shouldn't gang up on another country to change what they're doing. Nonetheless, it did, for example, condemn, Syrian abuses and things like that. So it does, whenever it feels that something's going wrong, it will make a kind of bland statement. My personal feeling, I think that they could go further, but this is for their reasons. And then they have other internal domestic reasons that do tend to pop up. For example, on Iran, it's completely different than China, actually. Their reasons for supporting Iran has a lot to do with the fact that India has a very strong and significant Shia minority that is about 25% of the Muslim population of India. That Shia population is one of the largest Shia populations in the world. It's something like 30 million Shias in India. And within the Indian Muslim population, the Shias tend to not have a dispute with the Hindus. So the Hindu-Muslim disputes that you usually see in India tend to be Hindus and the Sunnis. And what that means is that to the Indian political establishment, it's very important to keep the support of the Shias, because that is the group that is going to keep things calm. And keeping calm in India, inside India, between Hindus and Muslims is a very, very high priority. So the left-wing parties and the Shias in India tend to be very supportive of this and tend to be supportive of policies that support things like, Iran, even Syria and Palestine and issues like that. So I think that that's really one issue. And it's related to the other one that again, when India looks at the Middle East and, for example, Syria and regime change, one of the things that's going through their mind, there's two things going through their mind with Syria. One is that Syria was a very strong friend of India in the past. The Assad regime supported India, for example, on Kashmir, on UN Security Council seats. These are things that India tends to value very highly. An old friend, need to support them, that type of thing. But there's another trend that's underlying there, which is that India does have some fear, some Indians at least have some fear, that as these democratic revolutions happen in the Middle East, what they're seeing is a trend towards democratically elected Islamist regime. And the Indian government is obviously very fearful of any type of Salafist Muslim regimes heading up countries that used to be secular, authoritarian, secular, and friendly towards India. So there's a lot of issues domestically at play here that don't come up, but it's not the same reasoning. Whether or not that matters to the U.S., I don't know, but I think that for the long term, it does make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add there? There's also a strategic rationale for India. India and Iran both support the same actors in Afghanistan. Historically, they supported the Tajiks and the Uzbeks against the Pashtuns and against the Taliban. They both have an interest in stability. They both have an interest in marginalizing the Taliban. And that's one of the reasons they cooperate. When we talked about, the challenges that these countries pose, really one of the points that, we wanted to make is that they're very different types of challenges. Yes, we won't go to war with India the way that we could possibly, although I think it's unlikely, with China over Taiwan. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean there aren't all kinds of regional challenges. And we have to be careful in our relations with India that we're not exacerbating sort of nested security dilemmas and sub-regional tensions. So India, at least from a Pakistani perspective, India is fighting a proxy war with it in Afghanistan. It's supporting now Karzai, it's splitting the Pashtuns. Historically, it's supported Pashtunistan. And of course, the Pashtuns straddle the border there. India didn't condemn the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So, the sort of Pakistan-India fight over Afghanistan is long-standing, and from a Pakistani perspective, they view this certainly as a proxy struggle and as a potential threat. With India attempting to, right now, India is giving large amounts of aid to the Afghan government, and I think the Pakistanis are certainly concerned about being marginalized in Afghanistan. And this, from a U.S. perspective, one thing we have to think about is the extent to which this gives added motivation to the Pakistanis to support the Taliban. So, it's a very complex, sort of rich mix there, but that's...
Sorry, I just have to add one last thing.
Sure.
Since it's a debate. But I think on the Taliban issue, it's important to clarify that the Pakistanis were supporting the predecessors of the Taliban before they were the Taliban. So it's actually the other way around. I would say, actually, in that sense, it probably would have been in our interest if we had let the Soviet Union take Afghanistan, but that's another issue, neither here nor there. But but I do think that the Indian support of the Northern Alliance and the Pakistani support of the Taliban, for many years, we actually acceded to the Pakistani support of the Taliban as long as we didn't see why it was infringing on our interests until 9/11 occurred. And I think that's a very important oversight on our part. And this is something that actually talking with India more for the decades would have been helpful in this, because India had been actually very, very critical of the Taliban for its harsh policies and of, again, the predecessors of al-Qaeda, but we just kind of ignored it as, oh, well, they just don't like the Pakistanis. But I think that it's very important to now see, what type of monsters have come out of this over time.
Mm-hmm. And let me make one more.
Go ahead.
Sorry, but I think Rollie has an even larger point here, which is about blowback and future consequences of current actions. So, we did support the Taliban and other insurgent groups against the Soviets. That was part of our policy against the Soviets, and this came back to haunt us, obviously, in a large way. I would say we need also to think about the shadow of our future in our current relations, our current dealings with China and other actors. And if we're thinking of India simply as a linchpin or as a balance against China, and we're leaping to certain decisions, this could have future consequences, and I think none greater than our nuclear agreement with India. India is the only nuclear weapon state that's not an NPT member. We got them to sign an additional protocol, but it's extraordinarily weak. This has immense consequences for the whole non-proliferation regime. Now you have other actors like the South Koreans saying in their bilateral negotiations with the United States over revision of the civilian nuclear agreement, why can't we do reprocessing? Look what you did with India. Of course, we also have a special arrangement with Japan as well. But this has had consequences, and I think will continue to have consequences long into the future. So the broader point, I think, is about blowback and about thinking about the future consequences of our current desire to balance the current bogeyman.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So sticking on the theme of rogue states, as we talked about the UN and also regional conflicts, I wanted to bring up Myanmar. It's a country where the U.S. has had a pretty strong, until very recently, a pretty strong sanctions regime, trying to isolate the regime. And neither India nor China were particularly cooperative with U.S. efforts to isolate the regime. And I wonder if you could talk about that, and in particular, is it indicative of the potential for future cooperation? Is it indicative of two very independent-minded countries, or is it a similar motivation for both countries in that regard?
You want me to start?
Sure, either way. Well, I'll just start here. India did engage Burma, long before the current round of reforms. In fact, we looked at India and China's relations with a larger set of, quote-unquote rogue regimes, investments in Sudan, Burma, Iran, Syria, and Cuba. This is one of the complaints that we've had over time with China, is that they invest in these locations and support the regimes there. In looking at their investments, however, India has invested in exactly the same locations, oftentimes in partnership with Chinese firms. So the NOCs, the national oil companies of both China and India, have been and remain in all of those countries. As I said, India became involved in Burma, how many years
1993.
ago? 1993, okay. It's not the only country to have broken with the United States on sanctions against Burma. Thailand as well has been involved there. The Burmese, prior to that, were extraordinarily dependent on China, on Chinese aid, on trade with China. They had no desire necessarily to be in that position, so they were actually quite eager to develop relations with others, with the Indians and Thailand. It's not clear to me that the Chinese actually opposed this. The Chinese have an interest in stability in Burma as well. It's often said that there's geostrategic competition between the three of them, but they have economic interests there that aren't necessarily zero-sum. All these countries are developing infrastructure throughout Burma. The U.S. position was that we should isolate Burma and bring it down. Burma was engaged, obviously, by China, but also by these other two. I'm not sure, if we had to decide what the main factor was in change in Burma. I don't know enough about Burma to say what it would be, but obviously, given the Cuban case, isolation doesn't always work. So I wouldn't say definitively until I'd studied it that actually engagement by India and Thailand and China didn't have something to do with change in Burma.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to look at when you see India's relations with Burma and China's is that when the Burmese junta was still in its evil phase, when it was called Slork and all this type of thing, China still had good relations with Burma in the past. After 1988, when they had the Burmese uprisings and Aung San Suu Kyi was, I believe, put under house arrest and so forth, or put in prison, at that point, India actually did not have relations with Burma on ideological or on principled grounds. It said, we're not going to have relations with this junta. They're just wrong, and they supported Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, in that time period, what happened was that China was able to build up relations with Burma very rapidly as India pulled back. And at that time, China started building, expanding its bases and so forth, ports off of Myanmar. And India was watching this from the side and saying, this is really scary because China is getting access to the Indian Ocean via Burma because we've sat back. That's what they're thinking. And so the Indians had to have a reassessment, and this actually is what pushed the change in 1993 when India said, okay, enough is enough. China is taking over Burma, and we don't want our interests getting squashed. We don't want the Chinese watching us from Burma and using the ports of Burma to possibly attack us later. So India opened up dialogue with Burma starting then, despite the fact that the U.S. didn't want them to. Because at a certain point, I think it's actually reasonable, frankly, that a country has to look at their own neighborhood first and say, okay, well, the U.S. doesn't really want, India to do this, but, Burma is the neighbor between India and China. And so, there are some certain pragmatic decisions I think they had to take. In the end, I don't know, was it India and China's relationship with Burma that eventually helped it open up somewhat? Burma did start making some moves towards some democratization and letting Aung San Suu Kyi join parliament and so forth. So they've made some moves, and I think that is why the U.S. was able to change its position. Now, the question really is, do we as the U.S. expect every time that we flip-flop or change our mind or something that all of our allies toady along behind us? Because it's a little bit absurd if you think about it, So I think it's nice that we all agree now, but I think it would have also been a bit absurd that when the U.S. said jump, everyone just jumped, and then the U.S. says, oh, well, no, sorry, now we're, kind of friendly with them, and why don't you come on? So, that's my view on that.
All right. Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting that this really, in your words, Rollie, or in your view, represents India's fear of rivalry with China.
Yes.
in Burma as its primary motivation in that respect. How much, I guess I would ask kind of one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. How much does India really, is India interested in a big alignment with the United States? We've talked about their motivations elsewhere, but looking directly at India's motivation with the U.S., how much is it motivated by, say, the rivalry with China and their own need to have an ally to contain regional threats? Or is there intrinsic desire in India for closer alignment? Rollie, you want to start?
Sure. I think that the Indians really are interested in a closer alignment with the U.S., and I don't think it's actually that closely related to their relationship with China. So I do think that India is pursuing what I would call maybe something like a two-pronged strategy. It does see China as, well, the 800-pound gorilla on the block, which it is. It's India's neighbor. They have territorial disputes. They have ideological disputes. They have historical disputes. They have, they have trade disputes. And so India needs to keep that in mind. And so India has been opening up trade and relations and trying to resolve the border disputes and trying to improve relations with China. So I do think that India is pursuing that route. And at the same time, I think India is pursuing greater relations with the U.S., who it respects very highly as obviously the big 800-pound gorilla democratic country in the world, and the one that it's growing trade with very, very rapidly, and strategic relations and defense relations with. I do think that India's concern, if anything, is opposite of what one might think. It's not that it's thinking, hey, maybe we can use the U.S. to help us band against China. I think it's actually the opposite. I think that they're thinking, gee, I hope that our closer relationship with the U.S. doesn't antagonize our growing relationship with China. So I think the Indians are hoping to build closer relationships with the U.S. and closer relationships with China without antagonizing each other. And so sometimes I believe it actually makes the Indians nervous when the U.S. speaks a little too loudly of, hey, we're using India to contain China. And then the Indians get kind of scared because they're thinking, well, gee, we're trying to we're trying to get the Chinese to stop antagonizing us. And so I think there's a little bit of a tough dynamic going on there that they're trying to work.
Eric?
I generally agree with that statement. There are, of course, differing views in India, and if you look at the security community, there is quite a bit of concern about China, has been for for a while. It's hard to say what they regard as their biggest threat, whether it's Pakistan or China. Whereas if you go to the foreign ministry or the economic ministries, there's really a much more positive vibe about their relationship with China. And I think some of this comes out in their position on international economic organizations. They really haven't taken a position on whether they favor, say, an ASEAN +6 arrangement, which would have China in it and be an ASEAN bloc, or an Asian bloc rather, or a TPP approach, which is much more sort of compatible with the types of interests that the United States has and cuts across Asia and Latin America.
Sorry, what's the TPP?
I'm sorry, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States actually didn't create, but it's been pushing it recently. It's unclear to me whether India could ever really qualify for it. It's difficult for all states to negotiate entry into it, or the terms of entry, but it's also unclear whether they even want to, if they could. If I can flip it around a little bit and talk from the Chinese perspective, they tend to India looms less large in their security thinking, although obviously larger now than it did, say, 3 or 4 years ago with India testing the Agni 5 and calling it the China killer. So I think on the strategic side, there is some concern about India's direction. But in general, the Chinese strategic community has, in some ways, welcomed the rise of China. It contributes to what the Chinese call, the development of multipolarity. They see a lot of common interests, not just on the sovereignty issues that we already talked about, but also some of the global governance issues. Obviously, it's another developing country and has overlapping interests there. They took similar positions and actually cooperated in the Doha round and Copenhagen on environmental issues. So I think they see quite a bit of overlap in their interests with with India. So I agree. It's a very mixed picture.
Okay. Well, there's with this sort of wide range of complex relationships between these countries, there's a lot of topics that we could talk about, but I thought I'd open it up to the audience to decide what sort of steer the conversation in the direction you're interested in, if there's anybody in particular.
I have kind of multiple questions. You can take them if you want them or not. I'd like to hear something about Bangladesh, something about the insurgency basically in the middle third of India that's, it seems that...
The Naxalite insurgency?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then why would China actually want India? I mean, it's just more problems that they've kind of gone past. It's not a competition for land, it's not a competition for hearts and minds particularly, but why would India actually fear China other than the fact they've had these border clashes? But,
so the question is, why would China fear India?
yes.
Uh-huh. Okay. So in case you couldn't hear, the topics were Bangladesh, the Naxalite insurgency in India, and why would China fear India? Anything here that you guys want to comment on?
I'll just speak to the security side and the China-India relationship just very briefly. As you know, there are 2 areas that are in dispute: Aksai Chin in the west, and then Arunachal Pradesh in the east. Fought a war in 1962. I think, understandably, losers tend to have longer memories. So this has been really, a very bitter point for the Indians, and has created, enduring distrust that doesn't necessarily really exist in China. Again, this is a much India's sort of presence in the Chinese mind, I think, is much thinner. That said, again, India now has strategic nuclear weapons, so that at least puts it on China's radar scope. And then there are other things that have emerged since then as well. Indian companies have signed cooperative, exploration agreements with Vietnam at a minimum. I don't know if they've got any others, but the Chinese were quite unhappy about this, about the fact that Vietnam was going ahead and drilling in what it regards as contested areas. The Indians, I guess, very recently, the chief of the Navy in India said that India would defend its ventures in the East China Sea. So I think there are points of friction now developing elsewhere, and probably will increasingly be points of friction as both sides actually have power projection capabilities and their navies are now going beyond their own regions. But all that said, I think there are very large interests in common here. And the trade ties are growing. So not only are there large interests, but really growing economic interests in common.
Yeah, I would just agree with all of that. And adding to the historical part that's current to today is the Tibet issue. Of course, the Dalai Lama resides in India and receives support from India and his community of exiles from Tibet. So the Chinese still consider that a little bit of a thorn in their side from India. You're still holding on to the Dalai Lama. We already picked another one over here. That type of thing. And so there's that issue and yes, the economic competition as both countries continue to grow really rapidly. Energy resources and other resources, steel resources, iron ore resources, are going to come in as more and more crucial. So I think that on the China side, on Bangladesh, India traditionally had very good relations with Bangladesh. Obviously, in 1971, when Bangladesh was born from Pakistan,
with Indian help. Yes.
Yeah, with Indian help. Well, if you remember the details, actually, that's one of the reasons why India has some suspicion of the U.S. even, because in 1971, Pakistan had an election where they finally let East Pakistan really contest properly, and Mujibur Rahman, East Pakistani, meaning a Bangladeshi, won the election. And as soon as an East Pakistani won the election, the West Pakistanis were like, oh no, these elections are no longer valid, and said, we refuse to let him be prime minister. We're going to get our own on the West side, and basically started sending military force and so forth. Now, the Bangladeshis, if you look at it from the Pakistanis' point of view, the West Pakistanis' point of view, they'll say, well, the Indians, they helped break up Pakistan. If you look at it from the Bangladeshis' point of view, we were trying to have a legitimate democratic election, and the West Pakistanis were foiling it and stamping on us, and the Indians helped us out. So there's a perspective issue here. And where did the U.S. fall on this one? Unfortunately, the U.S. fell on the West Pakistan side, not on Bangladesh's side. So that was and considering it was a democratic election, that didn't reflect very well, I think, on us as far as India is concerned. But over the years, I would say that more tensions have accumulated with Bangladesh, between India and Bangladesh, over the issue of refugees and migrants and, Maoists and Naxalites, and all these other issues have popped up that have created tensions. And Bangladesh, of course, has also become, I would say, more, if you could call it Islamist, over the years than it was, I would say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there's been some shifts in tone between the countries.
I know we're still on question number one, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on history, but there's some really interesting points about the 1971 war, and there's also a different interpretation, or at least another side to the story. After the election and the instability, and I guess insurgency, I suppose you could say, in East Pakistan and Bangladesh, massive flow of migrants of refugees into India. So India certainly had a problem that it needed to deal with. It wanted stability restored, presumably or preferably on the basis of the election. On the other hand, not too far into the crisis, Indira Gandhi viewed this as a huge opportunity for India, and they did, prepare to intervene, and ultimately intervened massively using naval, air, and ground forces in Bangladesh. The U.S. had sources inside of the Indian cabinet. There are CIA cables that, at least reportedly, that have been declassified. They're purported to be CIA cables that suggested that that the United States was quite worried that India would go beyond East Pakistan, actually, and try to dismember West Pakistan. The U.S. did dispatch an aircraft carrier, and I guess my main point here is that dispatch, even though it was quite a distance from Bangladesh, and by the way, we weren't really taking sides with West Pakistan, I don't think. We were just signaling our interest in the issue, and I think more specifically signaling that we wanted to make sure that the Indians knew we had no interest in dismemberment of West Pakistan, in other words, of Pakistan as it's currently constituted. But that dispatch of the aircraft carrier, even though it was quite a distance from the conflict and really was no threat of direct participation, had a really very significant, remarkably significant impact on Indian thinking, reinforcing their desire to limit or prevent external powers from ever again intervening. I don't think it came up explicitly as one of the reasons that, for example, India developed nuclear weapons, but a lot of Indians actually have remarked that they need deterrence, including against the United States, for the purposes of maintaining sovereign decision making. And that was, just one of the events that fed into this. So, yes, we won't ever fight India, but on the other hand, there actually are direct security interests between India and the United States. Or at least from the Indian perspective, there's a fear of U.S. intervention and a fear of, that the U.S. might take efforts that would limit Indian room for maneuver.
Yeah, I certainly experienced in my position as a U.S. government official in New Delhi, there's a lot of lingering suspicion of the U.S. because of this historical support for Pakistan in various different forms, and that's certainly one easy example to point to. To the question about the Naxalites, in case other folks aren't as familiar, the Naxalites are, in principle, a Maoist insurgency that's taking place in India in sort of less populated wooded areas, densely forested areas, that has a Maoist ideology. And when I was in Delhi, I was curious about this insurgency because you don't hear a whole lot about it in the U.S. And they're called Maoists, and I was wondering if there's maybe some implicit support from China in this insurgency to sort of disrupt India. As far as I could ever tell, these insurgents, although they're called Maoists, they're really a lot like what you think of as the leftist guerrillas in Colombia, who've turned into essentially just narcotics gangs who control territory. These groups similarly are essentially extortion groups that work as gangs much more than any sort of a true ideologically driven attempt for independence or something. Although that's what they put out to the public. So I don't think it's the Naxalites are directly related to the sort of India-China rivalry. As far as I ever heard, there was no explicit link from, or even really hinted at link that maybe the Chinese are supporting them. Other questions?
I think Rollie alluded to the fact that although China has a lot of territorial disputes, a lot of these remain to be disputes, continue to be disputes because of political reasons, and not all of them are really strategically that important. Now, is it conceivable that once, if and when the territorial dispute with India is resolved and are no longer an issue, then opens up a lot more avenues for cooperation? So, Eric, are you willing to take your thesis of double trouble to a level of convergence where actually India and China join together, okay, and maybe 1-2 generations from now collectively pose a challenge to the West, both economically and militarily?
That was a question for me, unfortunately. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned this because this lets me respond a little bit to Rollie's earlier point about territorial disputes. Because I'm not sure that I fully agree with that. I came out all kumbaya and love, and Rollie's original statement actually established some of the differences between our positions. I think we still agree on most points, but Rollie alluded to the territorial disputes which China has, and I think she said with most of its neighbors. There's a big difference actually between what China and India, for that matter, have done on their land borders and maritime issues. So China actually has resolved outright fully its land border disputes with 12 of its 14 neighbors, which is quite remarkable. I think there was one big tranche set that were resolved in the 50s, and then around the time of reform and opening, they resolved most of the outstanding differences. The two that are not resolved are the one with India, and I believe Nepal is the other one, which actually has something to do with the Chinese relationship with India. So on that front, in many ways, China moved faster and more decisively to settle its land boundaries than India did. India, I did a lot of research on Indian land border disputes, and it was very difficult to determine because there are all types of ways of phrasing whether they've agreed on the strip map or the postmarks or this, that, and the other thing. And it's difficult to determine exactly when you call a land border completely settled. But at the time of our writing, India had settled its land borders with 2 countries, still had mostly settled its borders with 2 other countries, and had outstanding disputes still, although had made some progress with China and Pakistan. So I think in some sense, actually China's been more decisive on its land borders. Maritime is there's a big issue in East Asia over maritime borders, and many of these do involve China. They don't only involve China. So, for example, there are disputes between Korea and Japan. Part of the difference between the importance of maritime issues in the Indian case and the Chinese case is geography. That the South China Sea and the East China Sea are surrounded by other countries. Southeast Asia, most of those states surround the maritime domain there. So there are all kinds of overlapping boundaries. Then I think it's also important to remember that even though these have been hot issues, these disputes over maritime issues are sort of hot, contentious issues right now, there's a reason why they're troublesome at this point in history. With the signing of the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, it required states to state their positions, their baselines, their claims. It also gave countries new access to maritime resources. So countries have more interest in asserting claims, and they've been required to assert claims, which means, of course, the conflicts over boundaries are going to come out at that point, as they have. That's not to say they're not dangerous. I could probably at this point more easily imagine an armed dispute between China and one of its neighbors over a maritime issue than, for example, over Taiwan. Last point on this issue, though, is with regard especially to the U.S.-China relationship, our differences over maritime issues there relate to the interpretation of the law of the sea, and specifically to participant nations' rights within the exclusive economic zone. The Chinese have a more restrictive view of, a more liberal view, I guess, of what countries are allowed to do within the rights that they have within their own zones. In other words, countries can restrict the activities of other countries within their own exclusive economic zones. They can restrict the military activities of other countries and the economic activities of other countries. India actually has a fairly similar position on this issue, though. So it's hotter between the United States and China, but largely because we're toe-to-toe and we have a large military presence in East Asia, and we have disputes with them over a variety of issues. But China has also lodged complaints similar to those that China has lodged over activities of the same ship, actually, the Bowditch, which is one of the Taegos ships. Basically, these are ships that go out and record the noise made by submarines. And neither state likes the U.S. trolling around with Taegos ships in their exclusive economic zone. So there are some similarities on the maritime side as well. So that didn't answer your point about a possible resolution of the disputes between China and India. I think at this point those disputes are going to be tough to resolve because of public opinion in both countries. It's actually gotten harder, I think, rather than easier. But hopefully they can shelve them. Sorry.
Did you have anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'll just say that, yes, I referred to the maritime disputes as territorial disputes earlier, so I am corrected. However, they're still disputes. And I think that last week at the ASEAN meeting in Cambodia, I think China made it very clear that it had a very strong difference of opinion with the ASEAN countries. When China, who kind of, as far as I'm concerned, kind of bullied Cambodia into making a statement saying that, all the territorial disputes with these ASEAN countries have been resolved and we, agree not to internationalize them. And Vietnam and the Philippines really took issue with that and, made a statement saying absolutely not. We do not accede to this, and we do not agree with China's or Cambodia's statement on this, and we will, stand our ground. So I think that it remains, an issue. That's all.
Dangerous.
Yeah, dangerous.
Yeah, I think the South China Sea disputes and how China has been treating ASEAN nations has actually been a real boon for the U.S. in the sense that it's generated a lot of interest of small countries that know they can't stand up to a China to have stronger relations with the U.S. as a counterweight to China, because China's been so pushy on that particular issue. And to my mind, it's difficult to understand, or I should say, China's paying a high cost for that policy. I think, in the back, and then we'll come down here.
There's a lot of concerns about the economic model that China is pursuing, that it's not quite sustainable, not equitable, that it is sort of like growth on steroids driven by FDI and exports. So I'm really curious, between the two of you, which of the two economic models do you see as sustainable over the long run? India's growth has been characterized as being organic, ground up, a lot more about an entrepreneurial class. And so I'd be curious to hear again your views on India-China economic model.
I'll let you guys talk, and then I'll throw in my
Yeah,
two
I
cents.
was actually going to say, really, Russell should answer this
Russell
question.
should really take the
'cause
lead on this one.
Okay.
I've probably read some of the articles that
Yeah.
you actually understand, but I think Russell is better.
So my sense is I have for a long time wondered about the sustainability of the Chinese economic model. My focus is more on financial markets and the banking system in particular. I worry a lot about its reliance on rapid growth to basically turn big piles of bad loans into small piles of bad loans when they're in proportion to a rapidly growing economy. If China slows down, whether that banking system, that's relied on economic growth to make its problem loans disappear, won't face the music at some point that could potentially be very detrimental to the Chinese economic system. I have my own gripes, though, with the Indian economic system, and there, my gripe really is, or my basic interpretation is that India has grown really strongly on the basis of an economic model that is services-driven. And the reason why it's worked as a service-driven economy is because the service sector doesn't rely very heavily on public sector, public goods. Whether that's infrastructure or education, and that other forms of economic growth, like traditionally developing countries will go through a major growth of manufacturing and often export-oriented manufacturing. That's really been impeded in India by the inability of both state and central level governments to supply to provide adequate supply of public goods. And I think the reason why we've seen a dramatic slowdown in India over the last 2 or 3 years is that essentially the growth model that depended on services has finally hit the true bottleneck, and the constraints in the economy now are government action, and it's really until we see India, if you're not familiar, has a tremendous political gridlock problem of its own, much similar, unfortunately, to the U.S. And that until that's resolved and you see much better performance on providing public services by the Indian government, that the Indian growth model is going to be severely constrained. In the meantime, the Chinese model appears to be motoring ahead reasonably well, but I would say I do have my strong suspicions that there is a house of cards element to the China, especially on the financial sector side. I don't know if you guys have any other.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I'd simply say that I think that India would do very well to get rid of some of its bureaucracy and be able to liberalize, but of course its political system is the roadblock to that one, and that's something that the Chinese have been able to streamline really, really well, but of course the Chinese have other problems that Russell mentioned,
And I mean, they both have future demographic issues. China much earlier than India, so in China I'll hit those issues as well. And speaking of public services and social issues, China has vast problems in that area as well. So, I think they're.
Yeah, neither of them has a guaranteed continuation of the kind of success that we've seen in recent years.
Right.
Is still more questions? Yeah.
Yes, India has numerous political parties. Are there differences within the political parties on international issues as to positions they advocate, or is the differences mainly on domestic policies?
Go ahead.
Sure. Yes, no, they have differences on foreign policies as well as domestic policies because, for example, the more left-wing parties, including sort of more the Congress Party, but the left wing of it, and the communists, there's communist India, and socialists and so forth, they would be far more likely to stand up against the U.S. in some sense, sometimes, because they'll say, well, we don't want the corporations to come and take us. That's the evil Walmart is coming to take all of India. That's I would say the left-wing argument. Now on the other side, but then there's a huge amount of the people in that same party that would say, yes, we love America, we want democracy, we want the companies to come. On the right wing, you have things like the BJP, who will have a similar argument. They might say, gee, we don't want the American big companies to come, but because they're imperialists, and so they'll have a completely different logic. I mean, it's similar to our left wing and our right wing. So the right wing in America might say, we don't like China because they're a communist, and the left wing might say, we don't like China because they're damaging the environment and human rights. So they may end up to the same conclusion, but for different reasons. And then the center, maybe more moderate. And I would say that India has the same type of thing. You'll see that the center tends to be very, very moderate on a lot of different issues, but both different sides may have different policies, program ideas on everything from Palestine and Israel to, Arab Spring, U.S. and China. So definitely domestic and international.
I think there's some convergence between the two major between the BJP and Congress on both economic issues, and that includes international and domestic as well as foreign policy to some extent. The bigger issue to me, or at least as far as political change is concerned, is the diminution of dominance by the BJP in Congress and the proliferation of caste-based and parochial regionally based parties, so that Congress now has it's got a coalition that's not even a majority as a coalition. It itself has 200 out of 550 seats. Even if you added the main opposition party, the BJP in Congress together, it's not much. It wouldn't be much of a majority. So I think that will have some consequences for India's ability to exercise decisive leadership on a range of issues.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that I was actually surprised, as I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm an economist, but when I was in India paying attention to the different parties, I was surprised by how little many of these smaller parties have any foreign policy whatsoever. And so, their agendas are very narrow, and so you ask them a foreign policy question, and you may really just get a blank stare or, a relatively benign answer to sort of avoid the issue. And so as these smaller parties have become a more important part of the Indian political scene, I think you really do see a watering down of the foreign policy debate, as it's sort of focuses much more on smaller local issues, even within parties that are representing in the national legislature. I think we have time for one more question. In the back.
There's a lot of airtime being pulled in today's press on income disparity in this country, and my completely uneducated understanding of India and China is they have vast numbers of uneducated and extreme poverty. So my uneducated question is, are there in India and in China similar social concerns about income disparity and poverty?
So the question is, do India and China have similar concerns about income disparity and poverty as we see in the United States?
I can take a first stab at it. I would say that the main difference, I think that both countries have a very severe problem with income inequality, and to some extent, it's very funny that the Communist Party, Communist country of China, has a worse problem of it than India does, because so many people have gotten so rich there now. But both countries have a problem. The main issue of difference, I would say, between the two of them is that China has a much larger challenge of the fact that its income disparity and ethnic fault lines fall in the same place far more than they do in India. So, for example, in India, you have a lot of poor lower caste Indians and a lot of poor Muslims, and they're spread all over the place. And so they're not conglomerated necessarily in one spot. You do have poorer states, but the real poverty is a little bit almost everywhere in a lot of states. In China, you have Tibet and Xinjiang in particular, which are ethnically different, and even the Mongolian areas, ethnically different minority places that have the lowest incomes in China. And what that does is it adds fuel to the fire. So you have these groups of people that already have a different ethnic group, feel that their language is being trampled on or that their language is being taken away from them, and they're very, very poor. And they see, Han Chinese moving in who have a lot more money. So I think it exacerbates the ethnic tensions that they have far more than it does even in India, which in India it still does too. But anyways, that's me.
Yeah, I'll just speak to the Chinese side. I think that there's a big problem, and it's a growing problem. There's really an enormous problem. The Chinese are very aware of it in some forms, at least. They're particularly sensitive to the gap between urban areas and the countryside. The countryside actually did fairly well early on in reform, but since then its growth rates have lagged fairly dramatically behind growth rates in the urban areas. So there's a growing gap there. Part of the solution to that has been internal migration. So you have a quote unquote floating population of 100 million plus people who are temporarily working in the cities and returning income to the countryside. They maintain a residence in the countryside. They're farm residents. But that's changing also as well with land takeovers for development, some loosening of land transfer rights. So now you're getting a larger population of families moving to the city, and they don't have full access to services. There's the passbook regulations in China, which historically have limited access to services in the cities. The government's is committed to doing away with that, but the cities have found other ways to deprive these immigrants of services. So you have the poorest folks in China moving to the cities, denied services, and having to send their children to to private schools to pay tuition for those kids to get some kind of an education, only very rudimentary. So you have a growing, really underclass in the cities. I wrote an article, actually also with George, on that we called the Latin Americanization of China about this. Many Chinese economists see the solution to the rural-urban gap as accelerating the urbanization, accelerating the flow of people from the countryside to the cities. But I think this is going to create new problems. It's a new structural underclass in China's cities, which the Chinese government doesn't seem as aware of. And I do have to say, it's interesting to me that article has probably gotten more circulation than anything else I've ever done, and it's circulated in China. So the Chinese are very concerned about the growing gap. They're very concerned about the connection between poverty and the income gap and social stability. It's something that I think probably, as Rollie said in the beginning of this conversation, this is really their primary security concern is internal stability, and that's directly tied to economic growth, but also the distribution of wealth.
All right, well, we'll close with that. I won't make an attempt to summarize what we've talked about, in part because I tried to summarize at the beginning and was corrected by both of our speakers on the accuracy of my summaries. So I will note that if you're interested in more, I certainly learned a lot today. I thought both of you did a fantastic job, and I learned a lot. If you want to learn more, both of their books are available for sale on Amazon. So feel free. They're both still in print. And we do have a small token. Let me see if I can remember which is which.
That's
Token of
nice. Thank you.
Gratitude from the Baker Institute.
Thanks very much,
Thank you.
Russell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the speakers. And thank you all for coming tonight.